Entry is restricted to verified buyers only. The words hung in the air like frost as the security guard blocked the entrance to the Grand Palais auction room. Behind him, crystal chandeliers bathed the space in golden light, illuminating the silhouettes of tuxedoed men and women draped in jewelry worth more than most people's homes. Through the gap between the guard's arm and the doorframe, a single wine bottle gleamed on a velvet pedestal, Chateau Beaumont, 1978, the lost vintage, expected to sell for over $2 million that evening. Alain Beaumont stood motionless, his weathered hands clutching an invitation that had cost him a month's pension. At 76, his tweed jacket frayed at the elbows and his tie slightly askew, he looked nothing like the other attendees. The guard's eyes flickered to Alain's scuffed shoes, then back to his face with thinly veiled disdain. Behind him, a group of young financial executives snickered as they breezed past, flashing platinum credentials. "Please." Alain's voice trembled slightly, his French accent thickening with emotion. "I made that wine with these hands." The guard's expression didn't change, but a few heads turned. Someone whispered, "Isn't that adorable?" followed by sophisticated laughter that felt like shards of glass. What none of them noticed was the tall figure in a perfectly tailored Tom Ford suit, pausing near the entrance, sunglasses sliding down just enough to reveal intense eyes taking in the entire scene. Leonardo DiCaprio had not planned to be the evening's moral compass, but as he watched the old winemaker's dignity being trampled by the elite crowd, something shifted in his expression. This would not stand. The Chateau Beaumont, 1978, had achieved mythical status in the wine world. Only 12 bottles had ever been produced, crafted during a summer of perfect growing conditions that would never be replicated. 11 bottles had been purchased by collectors immediately, but the 12th, Alain's personal bottle, had been presumed lost for decades until it mysteriously appeared at auction. Wine critics called it the perfect expression of terroir, but none of them knew the truth of what made it special. Alain Beaumont had poured his soul into that vintage. His vineyard in Burgundy, barely 5 acres, sat on a slope where his family had grown grapes for 3 generations. The summer of '78 had followed his wife Marie's death, and he had channeled his grief into those grapes, sleeping among the vines, touching each cluster daily, speaking to them as if they were children. The resulting wine wasn't just fermented grape juice, it was history and heartbreak, bottled by a master. The auction room hummed with anticipation as collectors flipped through glossy catalogs. Diamond-crusted watches caught the light as champagne flowed freely. A hedge fund manager loudly proclaimed to his entourage, "I'll add it to my collection, though I'll never actually drink it, of course. Who would waste $2 million on something you consume?" Outside, Alain pressed his palms against the cool glass of the entrance doors, watching the celebration of wealth from a distance. The bottle on display, his bottle, seemed to glow beneath the spotlight. How had it ended up here? He had kept that final bottle for decades, saving it for a moment that never came. When his small vineyard faced foreclosure last year, the bottle had disappeared from his cellar. He had suspected his nephew, always desperate for cash, but couldn't prove it. Now, here it was, a world away from the humble cellar where it had aged in darkness for 40 years. "Excuse me, sir. Is everything okay?" The voice was distinctly American, warm with genuine concern. Alain turned to find himself looking up at Leonardo DiCaprio, though he didn't immediately recognize the actor without the context of a movie screen. "They won't let me in," Alain said softly, embarrassment coloring his cheeks. "That is my wine they are selling. I made it with my own hands during the summer after my Marie died. I just wanted to see it one last time, to say goodbye." Something changed in DiCaprio's expression, a hardening around the eyes, a subtle clench of his jaw. The actor had spent enough time in France for his own passion project vineyards to recognize the significance of what the old man was saying. "You're Alain Beaumont?" DiCaprio asked, his voice dropping to a reverent whisper. The actor removed his sunglasses completely now, tucking them into his jacket pocket. "The Alain Beaumont?" "Sir, I've read about your 1978 vintage in every serious wine publication. It's considered one of the greatest expressions of Burgundy ever created." Alain's eyes widened slightly, surprise momentarily replacing his dejection. He hadn't expected to be recognized, especially by someone like Leonardo DiCaprio. The revelation seemed to straighten his posture slightly, returning a flicker of dignity to his bearing. "What's your plan here tonight?" DiCaprio asked, gesturing toward the auction room, where attendees continued to flow in, each passing glance at Alain more dismissive than the last. "I just wanted to see it," Alain replied, his voice cracking slightly. "To be in the room when they sell it, to hear what they say about it." He paused, looking down at his worn shoes. "And perhaps, if possible, to tell them what is actually in that bottle, not just wine, but my story." DiCaprio nodded slowly, a plan forming behind his eyes. He placed a hand gently on the older man's shoulder and said quietly, "Mr. Beaumont, I think we can arrange that. Would you allow me to be your host this evening?" The security guard's expression transformed instantly when Leonardo DiCaprio approached with Alain. The velvet rope was unhooked without a word, the previous dismissal replaced by deferential nods and a muttered, "Mr. DiCaprio, an honor." The actor guided Alain into the auction room with a gentle hand on his back, the disparity between their appearances drawing curious glances from the assembled elite. DiCaprio wore his fame like a comfortable garment, nodding at acquaintances, but keeping his focus on the elderly winemaker whose emotions seemed to intensify with each step closer to his creation. "That's Julian Castor," DiCaprio whispered, subtly indicating a silver-haired man surrounded by assistants. "He's the one who consigned your bottle. Hedge fund manager from London, collects wines purely as investments." Alain's eyes narrowed slightly. The name meant nothing to him, but the concept was familiar. People who viewed wine not as art or nourishment, but as financial assets to be traded like stocks. He'd spent his life creating something meant to be experienced, not locked away in temperature-controlled vaults, appreciating in value, but never fulfilling its purpose. They found seats near the front, DiCaprio smoothly declining offers to join various social circles, his presence causing a ripple of whispers and smartphone photos. The auctioneer was arranging his notes at the podium, occasionally glancing at his watch. The Chateau Beaumont was lot number 37, the crown jewel of the evening's offerings. "Look at them," Alain whispered, his accent thickening with emotion. "They speak of tannins and notes and vintages, but they know nothing of what makes wine truly special." His weathered hand trembled slightly as he pointed toward his bottle, displayed on its velvet pedestal behind bulletproof glass. "That wine contains the summer songbirds that sang while I pruned the vines. It holds the morning mists that rolled down the hillside. It captures the tears I shed over Marie's photographs as the grapes fermented." DiCaprio listened intently, his expression revealing genuine appreciation rather than celebrity politeness. A commotion near the entrance drew attention as Julian Castor made his official arrival, flanked by assistants and a woman draped in diamonds whose youth contrasted sharply with his 60-plus years. Castor spotted DiCaprio immediately, celebrities were easy to identify in any crowd, and made his way over, hand extended, hungry for another connection to add to his collection of influential acquaintances. "Leonardo, didn't expect to see you here, expanding your collection?" Castor's voice carried the polished accent of someone who had worked hard to erase his original one. His eyes darted curiously to Alain but didn't linger, dismissing the old man as unimportant. "Just supporting a friend," DiCaprio replied smoothly, placing a hand on Alain's shoulder. "Julian Castor, meet Alain Beaumont." The name registered immediately. Castor's practiced smile faltered for just a moment before returning at full wattage. The winemaker? What an unexpected surprise. He extended his hand to Alain with newfound interest, though his eyes revealed calculation rather than genuine warmth. "Monsieur Castor," Alain acknowledged, his handshake firm despite his age. "I am curious how my personal bottle came to be in your possession. It was missing from my cellar last year." A flash of discomfort crossed Castor's face. "I acquired it through a reputable dealer in Lyon, all perfectly legitimate, I assure you. Documentation is impeccable." He turned to DiCaprio, clearly seeking to change the subject. "Leonardo, you must join us at our table. Much better view of the proceedings." "Actually," DiCaprio replied, his casual tone belying the intensity in his eyes, "we're quite comfortable here, and I think Mr. Beaumont deserves the best view of his creation, don't you?" The auction room had grown more crowded, the energy building as the auctioneer tested his microphone. Castor's companions were beckoning him to their reserved section, but he hesitated, suddenly uncertain about the situation he found himself in. "Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. We'll begin in 5 minutes," announced the auctioneer, his British accent adding gravitas to the proceedings. Castor nodded curtly to DiCaprio and Alain before retreating to his table, leaning immediately into intense whispers with his associates. "He's nervous," DiCaprio observed quietly. "I suspect the provenance of that bottle might not be as impeccable as he claims." Alain's eyes hadn't left his creation, the bottle gleaming under precisely positioned lights that made the deep burgundy liquid seem almost alive. "What are you planning to do?" he asked DiCaprio, finally turning to look at the actor. "That depends on what you want, Mr. Beaumont," DiCaprio replied. "We could simply watch, or—" his voice lowered further, "we could ensure that everyone in this room learns the true story of that wine." As the auction began, lot after lot of rare vintages sold for staggering sums to paddle-raising billionaires who barely looked up from their conversations to bid. The auctioneer's patter created a hypnotic rhythm of numbers climbing higher and higher. 30 minutes in, phones emerged as remote bidders joined the action for particularly coveted items. Through it all, Alain sat motionless, his eyes fixed on lot 37, waiting. DiCaprio, meanwhile, was texting rapidly on his phone, occasionally glancing toward Castor, whose attention remained divided between the auction and whatever was troubling him about Alain's presence. The actor leaned over to whisper something to an assistant who had joined them, then turned back to Alain. "Mr. Beaumont, when they bring out your bottle, would you be willing to tell its story? The real story?" Alain's eyes widened. They would never allow it. DiCaprio's smile was subtle but confident. "Let me worry about that part. Just be ready to speak from your heart when I signal you." The auctioneer's voice suddenly rang out clearer. "And now, ladies and gentlemen, we come to the highlight of our evening. Lot 37, the legendary lost vintage, Chateau Beaumont, 1978. Two white-gloved attendants approached the display case containing the Chateau Beaumont, moving with the ceremonial precision of royal guards. The auctioneer launched into a practice speech about the wine's legendary status, its perfect provenance, and its expected hammer price of upwards of 2 million euros. Phones emerged throughout the room as the ultra-wealthy prepared to compete. "Before we open the bidding," the auctioneer continued, "I'm told we have a special guest who has requested a moment to speak about this extraordinary lot. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Leonardo DiCaprio." A murmur of excitement rippled through the crowd as DiCaprio rose and approached the podium. Camera flashes sparkled across the room like fireflies. The actor's presence commanded immediate attention, his natural charisma amplified by the context of wealth and exclusivity. "Thank you," DiCaprio began, his voice carrying easily through the hushed room. "We're here to witness the sale of what many consider the finest wine ever produced in Burgundy. But there's something about this bottle that the catalog doesn't tell you. He paused, letting the tension build. The true value of great wine isn't just in its rarity or its price tag. It's in the story it contains, the passion that created it. Julian Castor shifted uncomfortably in his seat, exchanging glances with his legal advisor. Near the back, auction officials conferred in whispers, uncertain about this unplanned interruption. "I'd like to introduce someone special," DiCaprio continued, gesturing toward Alain, "the man who made this wine with his own hands, the artist whose creation you're bidding on today. Ladies and gentlemen, Alain Beaumont." The room fell silent as Alain rose slowly from his seat, his weathered face captured on the auction house's screens. DiCaprio extended his hand, inviting the winemaker to join him at the podium. With each step Alain took, the contrast between his modest appearance and the opulence surrounding him grew more pronounced. Reaching the podium, Alain stood before the microphone, his eyes finding his bottle like an old friend across a crowded room. When he spoke, his voice was soft but clear, his French accent lending authenticity to every word. "That wine was born in the summer of 1978, when the sun blessed my small vineyard in ways I had never seen before or since." Alain's gnarled fingers gripped the podium's edge. "But this is not just a story about perfect weather conditions, it is a story about love and grief." The auction room had gone completely still, the usual background murmur of wealth and privilege silenced by the raw emotion in the old man's voice. "My wife, Marie, had died that spring. For 42 years she had been my heart, my soul. Those grapes, they grew from soil watered with my tears." Alain's voice cracked slightly, but he continued, stronger now. "I slept in the vineyard that summer. I spoke to each vine. When I crushed those grapes, I poured my memories of Marie into the vats. This wine, it is not just fermented grape juice, it is my love story." On the video screens, several close-ups showed misty eyes among the audience. Even the auctioneer stood transfixed, his gavel momentarily forgotten. "That bottle was never meant to be sold. It was my personal bottle kept for—" He paused, emotion threatening to overcome him. "For the day I would join Marie. It disappeared from my cellar last year. Stolen. And now it is here, treated like a commodity." Julian Castor's face had lost its color. He whispered urgently to his lawyer, who shook his head slowly in response. Around them, smartphones had emerged in greater numbers, no longer to place bids, but to record this unexpected drama. The hashtag number sign Chateau Beaumont was already trending on multiple platforms. DiCaprio stepped forward, placing a supportive hand on Alain's shoulder. "Mr. Beaumont has one request before the bidding begins," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of his star power. "He'd like to ask the consignor, Mr. Julian Castor, about the provenance of this bottle." All eyes turned to Castor, whose usual confidence had evaporated under the collective gaze of the room and the damning implications of Alain's story. The auction officials huddled in urgent conversation, clearly unprepared for this situation. Castor began, rising unsteadily. "I purchased this through legitimate channels. I have paperwork—" "From my nephew, perhaps," Alain interrupted, steel entering his voice. "A young man with gambling debts who had access to my cellar? A bottle with no official record of sale because it was never meant to be sold?" The room erupted in whispers. The auctioneer tapped his microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, in light of these concerning allegations, we must temporarily suspend—" "No," DiCaprio's voice cut through the chaos. "I have a better solution." He turned to face the room, his expression resolute. "I'm prepared to purchase this bottle directly, here and now, for the full estimate of 2 million euros. He paused, letting the gasps subside. "But with one condition. The money goes to Alain Beaumont, the true owner, and the bottle returns to him as well." Castor half rose from his seat. "You can't do that. The consignment agreement can be nullified," interrupted a new voice. An auction house executive had approached the podium. If there's legitimate question of ownership, we have a responsibility to investigate. Mr. DiCaprio's offer provides an elegant solution that protects our reputation while addressing Mr. Beaumont's claim. The executive turned to Castor. Sir, unless you can produce definitive proof of legitimate acquisition right now, I suggest you accept this resolution before the situation escalates further. The room held its collective breath, all eyes on Julian Castor, whose empire of wealth and influence suddenly seemed to be crumbling under the weight of one old man's truth. Castor's surrender came not with words, but with a gesture, a slight nod before he sank back into his chair, defeat etched across his features. The auction house executive signaled to the auctioneer, who brought down his gavel with unusual gentleness. Sold to Mr. DiCaprio for €2 million, with revised terms as stated. The room erupted in applause, not the polite, measured kind that typically followed high-value sales, but something more genuine, more emotional. Alain stood motionless at the podium, overwhelmed by the turn of events, his eyes fixed on the bottle that had journeyed so far from his humble cellar. One of the white-gloved attendants carefully lifted the Chateau Beaumont 1978 from its display case and carried it reverently to the podium. DiCaprio guided Alain's hands to receive it, the cameras capturing the moment the elderly winemaker's fingers closed around his creation once more. Tears flowed freely down Alain's weathered cheeks, decades of memories held in his trembling grasp. "Thank you," he whispered to DiCaprio, his voice too soft for the microphone to catch, but the actor heard him clearly. "No," DiCaprio replied quietly. "Thank you for reminding everyone what true value means." As they stepped away from the podium together, the auction room stood in unanimous applause, phones recording the moment from every angle. The story spread across social media with the speed only reserved for moments of genuine emotional resonance. Chateau Beaumont and DiCaprio Hero trended globally within hours. Video clips of Alain's speech and the dramatic conclusion circulated on every platform, accompanied by thousands of comments celebrating the triumph of artistry and humanity over cold commerce. Outside the auction house, as the evening concluded, a small crowd of reporters had gathered, alerted by the viral explosion online. DiCaprio skillfully shielded Alain from the worst of the attention, but allowed a few respectful questions. "Mr. Beaumont, what will you do with the money?" called one journalist. Alain looked surprised, as if he'd forgotten the financial aspect entirely. The bottle in his hands had been his only focus. He glanced at DiCaprio, then answered with quiet dignity. "The vineyard my family tended for generations is facing foreclosure. Now it will be saved." A pause, then with a small smile. "And perhaps I will finally build the tasting room Marie always wanted, where people can come to experience wine as it should be, with stories and heart, not investment portfolios." The response triggered another wave of applause from the gathered crowd, many of whom were auction attendees who had followed the drama outside, their perspectives subtly altered by what they had witnessed. 6 months later, Leonardo DiCaprio stood in the newly renovated tasting room of Domaine Beaumont, surrounded by wine lovers who had traveled from across the globe not to consume a status symbol, but to hear a story. Alain moved among them with renewed vigor, his vineyard flourishing under the care of newly hired local workers, his legacy no longer in danger of being lost. On the central table sat the famous bottle, illuminated but not isolated, a symbol rather than a trophy. Beside it, a new vintage was being sampled, crafted with the same hands that had created the legendary 1978, now joined by apprentices eager to learn the art that transcended technique. "Some things cannot be bought," Alain told his visitors, his eyes meeting DiCaprio's across the room. "The true value of wine, of art, of anything we create, it lives in the story, in the heart behind it." DiCaprio raised his glass in silent toast, the sunset casting golden light through the windows Marie had always envisioned. Around them, people recorded and shared the moment, spreading a different kind of wealth than what had been celebrated in that auction room. The lesson resonated far beyond the vineyard. In a world obsessed with price tags, the most valuable things remain those created with love, preserved with respect, and shared with understanding.